Hey guys, and welcome back to Grizzly Valley. Today I'll lay the groundwork on the Japanese area, which, much like the Alpine area, is going to have a coaster as a centerpiece. And in this case I chose for a aerodynamics corkscrew coaster. A couple of reasons really. It's the only other coaster type, but I also really felt it would fit the Japanese area most as a type of tongue-in-cheek really, because Japanese parks are really known for their terrible aerodynamics coaster knockoffs and what they like to call jet coasters, which is coasters with this type of track which aren't exactly smooth, to say the least. So that's also why I wanted to go for a rather standard layout, just a double looping, double corkscrew layout, and try to at least make it not entirely smooth. So there were some parts where I intentionally left it not really that great, but I do have to say at this point in the time-lapse I was still deciding to leave out the corkscrews, because if there's anything that I would want to critique this game on, it's the fact that the elements in the game so far that it gives you are really terrible. But that said, it's still a part of an alpha game, and they also didn't want to originally put the coaster construction into this version of the alpha yet, so I shouldn't talk about that. But yeah, the corkscrews I thought weren't really good enough to actually feature. That's why I first built this helix. But you actually see later on in this video I decided to build my own corkscrews, which is part of the reason why this video in the end actually took 3 days to actually make, which is also why it's a little bit on the late side compared to my upload rate lately. But yeah, that's all for the coaster for now. The most important part that I'll be doing in this episode is work on the station, which more or less will also be a prototype for the rest of the Japanese theme, and there is quite a lot to actually talk about this, and I didn't explicitly mention this yet really so far. I want to go for a Japanese theme, and this has a couple of reasons. I obviously still want to experiment and see what you can actually do with the pieces in-game, but this feels a lot more experimental than just trying the Alpine theme or trying the main streets, because both the Alpine theme and the main street are at least still European, and I think much more closely resemble what the pieces in the pirate and generic theme are actually like. Whereas a Japanese theme isn't even Western, it's a completely different style of building, and it relies on a couple of things which simply aren't there in the game yet. I've seen a couple of people try the theme so far. Free the Bear actually has a Let's Play series on YouTube in which he's already tackled a more general Asian style, which is really cool to check out as well. And some other people have tried the theme as well, but there are a couple of really essential things missing, or many essential things missing really, and the thing that is there is just that one inclined curved roof, which is sort of the base of all of the Asian building. And I decided to, within the Asian theme, go for specifically a Japanese theme, because the differences between the very similar Chinese and Korean theme are quite important. Japanese theme uses more wood, less paint, so way less different colors and things like that are very uncommon in Japanese buildings, whereas you do quite often see it in Korean or Chinese buildings. There's also an issue with that Korean buildings, and this is an issue in the game in general, because Asian buildings do have these little pointy bits at the end of the roofs where they curve up, and where Japanese buildings only have this pointy bit curve up a little bit at the very end of the roof, for Korean buildings the entire roof is a curve, so there was no way I could actually do Korean. And comparing Chinese and Japanese, I have very limited knowledge of Japanese buildings, so I'm really not too sure how well this is going to work out in the end. But my Chinese is pretty much non-existent, and it really uses a lot different materials, which I really figured in the end isn't going to be quite as possible, since the Japanese theme uses a lot more raw wood and that wood texture, which I think the one that is in game and we have a couple of pieces of is quite useful to maybe turn into Japanese buildings. So about the station building specifically, I wanted to start off with the roof here, which does complicate things if I want to get into interiors and things like that. Though that said, I think I might want to do interiors and smaller details on live streams, because it doesn't quite work as well on time lapses, which is sped up 12 times. But an important reason why I wanted to start with the roof is because the roof is really, in Japanese culture, often the most prominent and important feature of a building. And you can almost really tell what building any building in Japan is just by looking at the roof. It's definitely, sometimes even in terms of height, the roof itself is higher than the rest of the building. It has many details and decorations, and Japanese buildings have multi-layered roofs as well. So that's why I wanted to start with it, just to get the general shape of it done, which is really the sort of main part in the middle with 2 wings on the side. It isn't particularly inspired by any specific building. I just sort of looked up many Japanese Buddhist temples, which is the general style which I figured would at least be most closely possible in the game, even though there are not actually pieces for it, so it's definitely lacking on the details, and the roof shape is also really hard to get close to. But that was a style which I generally wanted to follow. The only thing which, looking back, I'm still not sure about when it comes to this station and might well remove, is the roof sticking out in the front and at the back. There is that roof sticking out, very similar to the roof that sticks out in the Alpine station, but it's a very uncommon feature of Japanese buildings, so I might want to remove that and just keep the empty roof. But this was really just a decision which I made from the game perspective and also a theme park perspective, that just a flat roof doesn't quite look too interesting, and I don't have the interesting details on the roof which real Japanese roofs have to make it less boring. So really figured this extra roof sticking out at the front and the back could maybe bring it out a little bit more and make it less of a boring building to look at, which from a theme park perspective, and this is something I might want to note as well, might be helpful as well, because there isn't a lot of reference when it comes to Asian styles in theme parks. It's actually extremely uncommon, I found. There was actually a Busch Gardens with an Asian theme in Houston, which I wanted to find some things about for reference, but there's nothing about it since it's already gone for over 30 years. And the only real good reference is Epcot, which has a very small Japanese pavilion, but even then it's like, you might want to call it theme park Japanese almost. It's Japanese, it uses the Japanese details and overall shapes of it, but it doesn't follow the exact rules of Japanese buildings, and that's basically what I would like to say I'm sort of following in this case as well, especially given how Japanese buildings, much like the Roman or Greek buildings, are very specific with their dimensions, and there are different ideologies and philosophies between the exact dimensions and makeup of these buildings, which is something which I won't be able to add, and I'll really just try to make that theme park Japanese, where it really looks Japanese, and try to decorate it as much as I can and just see what I can really do there, but it won't be like a realistic Japanese theme temple in the end. That's basically what it boils down to. Though that said, it's definitely inspired by the Japanese Buddhist temples, and I'll still sort of follow that same logic in here with a small step or a small staircase leading up to the station with a path in front of it, and decorating that with some classical Japanese elements, which are probably the most recognizable elements of Japanese architecture for Westerners, or at least so I figured. Though that said, just a quick moment I would like to take is that I'm always up for feedback about Japanese buildings, especially about people who are more knowledgeable than I am. I actually got most of my knowledge about it, well, actually from a very long time ago, but I can't exactly boast about it. There was a Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 competition last summer where I participated in a team, and we made a Japanese theme park, which I did some research for, but we eventually lost the competition, so that doesn't entirely help a whole deal. But I also had an incredible Wikipedia spree the last couple of days, which was also really interesting. But aside from that, I am obviously still a Westerner, and I'm probably quite prone to something which I think is a very common pitfall in making Japanese buildings in theme park games. It's something which I very often see happening, is that you make Japanese buildings or any type of Asian building by using the elements and incorporating them into your building, but the overall building still has the makeup or entire composition of a Western building, which is really hard to explain, but it's basically Asian buildings are completely differently laid out and have different composition than European buildings, since the very core philosophies and ideas on what they're built is entirely different. Like, Japanese buildings don't have these fixed rooms with fixed purposes, but they have sliding rooms, and like any room can be used for anything and things like that, and they eventually end up making the entire architectural style completely different. And one of the things which I'm probably going to end up doing somewhat is make these buildings with definitely Japanese elements, but still in an overall sort of Western atmosphere. Anyway, I'm going crazily off topic again. Okay, so to actually talk a bit about my process of doing this, the most important part were definitely the inclined roofs, I think, and without that this theme would not have even been possible. But really the biggest challenge in trying to make this happen was the lack of corner roofs, where the corners of roofs are very common and very prominent in Japanese buildings, but there are no actual corner roofs in any of the tile sets except for the Spanish one, which obviously isn't going to work for Japanese at all because of the texture. So I am stuck with only gable roofs, which makes it very hard to make Japanese buildings since they very often have these corner roofs. So that was one really major limitation which I sort of had to get over in the design of this building, and that's also why I chose to build it in the way that I eventually ended up doing it. And the basic way of making this building was actually quite simple in terms of the grid. It didn't involve different grids at all, since it's pretty much just straight stucco walls which are very much on the grid, and it's mostly very time-consuming details that I wanted to get in. Japanese buildings have a lot of very intricate details in the woodwork, and obviously I don't have these very beautifully sculpted out details on the woodwork, but I still wanted to sort of make it look similar and visually similar from a distance at least, by adding all of these little beams, horizontal, vertical and roof beams, to at least sort of emulate the wooden details that Japanese buildings have, which is why this eventually turned out to be quite time-consuming building and took, I think, yeah, it was nearly 2 hours to build the station in total. But that was that. I also wanted to add a quick transfer track over here with a small storage building, where I was doubting for quite a while if I wanted to make this a themed storage building or if I just wanted to make it a grey box, because basically you need a storage building more or less to store the cars in that you don't use, unless your station is large enough to put them in there. But I needed to get a separate building in here, and I was really wondering if I wanted to make it a generic building or not, and in the end I went for this weird combination of making this side themed to at least not break the immersion of the Asian theme as you approach this building from the roller coaster itself, but for the other side I just sort of made that a generic backstage part where there's just air conditioners sticking out and HVACs, or at least that's the idea. So it's sort of themed on one side so it doesn't break the immersion, but aside from that it's really just a simple little storage building. I just really wanted to add that for realism. It's obviously not functional, and at the moment it's damn near impossible to actually make a convincing transfer track, so not entirely sure how well it's gonna really work out in the end, but I wanted to just have this for a bit of realism in anyway, and there was some space left here, so decided to give that a try, since I still did have to try making a transfer track. This would be a good opportunity to at least see if there's a future in that. It would actually be really cool to see transfer tracks in the game in the future, though that's just some random wish, I suppose. But yeah, that's the station and the similarly Buddhist architecture building next to it, which I'm not sure what to make out of, but the station is very much a temple-inspired building, and I think I'll also sort of theme the area around the station to be sort of this temple or palace-ish area, and make the rest of the Japanese area more like a smaller Japanese town, so less with the quite large architecture. The station is quite large, which is... It's not much larger than the Alpine station, but it's one of my worries about the station, is that it's maybe a bit too big for its environment. But yeah, that's more or less the fancy parts of the Japanese area, you could almost say. And the rest of the area is going to have some more flat rides and smaller townhouses and restaurants, or at least that's the general idea. I don't actually have an actual layout for it yet, or any specific plans, but that'll just sort of come up in the future, and I'm not really too worried about that. And actually, really looking back at this, my station was my biggest real worry about this part of the park, since it was really the only section where I didn't have a lot of confidence in, since I already practiced quite a bit with the Japanese theme and tried tried a couple of buildings and smaller details just to see how well it would actually work out. And while I tried some smaller houses, I didn't actually try a building as large as this station yet, so that's why I was really not too sure about it. And then here at the bottom, I wanted to do this thing which you commonly see around temples as well. They are placed on this small stone base which is slightly raised off the ground, and they have these steps in front of them. But while that's a pretty realistic thing, I do have to say this base is way higher than it is for any realistic Japanese temple, which is purely because it's obviously the station of the roller coaster and the track is pretty high, so I did want to raise that a bit. But at least I wanted to give it that same stone foundation that Japanese temples often have. And for the queue, actually, this is also one of the reasons why it took such a very long time to record this episode. I started with a queue in the middle of nowhere pretty much and figured I would get a queue building, but instead of that, like sort of halfway through making that building, I really figured it didn't look too great. So instead I figured might as well try something which is very similar to how the Imperial Palace in Kyoto has these walls around it. Many palaces and castles in Japan have this as well, and I really figured that would actually be pretty nice because these walls have these fancy gates, and I was really thinking having one of these gates as an entry sort of to the queue would actually be quite impressive and nice, and would also allow the queue entrance to be pretty close to the station building itself. So I really figured, well, might as well go for this and see how that ends up, and I was really much happier with that than having a station building, so that's some lost footage over there. And also something which I forgot to talk about, which happened a couple of minutes ago. I had those couple of shots about the corkscrews in, and you see the corkscrews over here in a lot of pathwork now, which is something that I cut out, at least for the most part, because it was painful to make those corkscrews in the end. It almost took me 2 hours, but I really wanted to make these custom corkscrews just to be able to make them larger and more smooth than the in-game ones. And I am really happy with how they came out and how they sort of make their way over the paths, but it was just hours of trial and error which don't work out well for making a time-lapse video whatsoever, so that was also cut out of this video, which is why this is more of like a collection of different time-lapses than anything. But while you're missing out on that, I do have to say I'm incredibly happy with how the corkscrews came out in the end. They're more smooth than I even expected, and as much as I was really doubting the in-game elements, you can actually make inversions yourself, and the biggest trick to this is really placing some things first and then just have some oddly shaped track and then just go back to it and tweak it a bit and smooth it out a bit and work on the banking long enough and sort of finalize it until at some point you really figure, well, this is gonna be good enough. And just by sort of doing that for quite some time, you can actually make some really cool smooth elements, which is really nice to see. Anyway, this is the sort of the palace wall which I figured I wanted to have here. I obviously won't decorate it too much because, well, there is no real sense in adding windows to a wall here. So I just wanted to quickly add this wall around the queue, which I will return to at some point in the distant future, but not quite yet, where I just want to very simply theme the queue, which is very similar to, I think I'll do it very similar to how Matterhorn bobsleds has their queue, which actually also goes underneath this roof for a bit and also has this part where it snakes through a garden. And I really think that would be very nice to try in here and make a little garden in between these walls and let the queue go through that. It's nothing too spectacular, but I really just wanted to do something with this which was not completely putting a building over the queue, because that just seemed very much out of place. So here's how I quickly made the transfer track. Really, it's something which I did try once before. I did actually, yeah. What am I saying? I actually did that in episode 5, I think. Yeah, so I did try a transfer track before, but not actually completely finalize it, so that happened this time. And I also wanted to add these quick little lanterns over here, because they're an essential part of the temples in Japan. They always have these little stone lanterns. You might know what I'm talking about. I think they call them Toro, which are, I think, are really beautiful, and I really wanted to get along the sides here, sort of along the entrance way to the temple, as you would very often see. And they don't actually work. I tried putting some lanterns inside them, but the lighting does some strange stuff when it's inside a chimney. Though that said, chimneys are absolutely everything. They're actually lanterns right now as well. But yeah, it means I can't exactly put the lanterns inside the chimney, which was kind of a bummer since the lighting just doesn't work that well, so decided in the end to put some lighting on top of them. But still, the overall idea is that... Oh, and also these plants, I was so happy with how these turn out. I made a couple of these before this video as well. It's basically a couple of wooden posts and then just some bushes on top of it to make some of those Japanese plants, because one of the big things at the moment, of course, is the lack of vegetation. So I was really afraid that if I would just use the legacy stuff in there, then, well, any park is going to end up looking very similar to other parks since everybody uses the same vegetation. And this is especially true for Japanese gardens, because they are very different from European gardens, and it especially comes down to the way like they have these trimmed bushes and trimmed topiary-like plants, but unlike the European topiaries where they shape them into elephants and cones and whatnot, they have this more like flowy idea of little, it's so hard to describe, little blobs of trimmed bushes that sort of flow in an area and sort of like wave-like patterns, and that's something which I sort of wanted to try my hand at quickly with those bushes there, and I was actually quite happy with how it turned out. The posts don't even look too fake. And then over here, just as a quick little entrance, I wanted to make a small wooden torii gate, which you always see at the entrance of any temple. And although I'm of course not too happy about how it looked in the end, since there obviously aren't really pieces for this, I'm still surprised with how it came out. So this is how the finalized, or almost finalized, station looks like, I should say. It's not entirely final, I might still want to add some small benches and little details around here, and of course the guests are missing, and that just makes it look so lifeless. But yeah, this is pretty much the finished station with the little wall with the entrance in it, and some of the gardens that surround it. And looking back, I do have to say this was really one of those buildings where during the building process I was so worried about how it was going to turn out, but especially with these gardens added to it, I think it's actually convincingly Japanese, and I'm looking forward to do the rest of this area actually, even though it's going to be quite different, and it is already very different from what I've tried so far. I think this will be a lot of fun. So thank you guys for watching this video, and see you guys in the next one, in which I'll be trying to add some of those smaller houses and decorate the area a little bit.